There are moments in life you know you will remember forever, not because they are beautiful, but because they change you down to the bone. The night of December 24th, 2022, was one of those moments for me. I am going to tell you about the evening I stood before the thick oak door of my wine cellar, the place I had spent a lifetime building, where I had poured not only sweat and money, but love, memory, and every breath of 30 years of my life, and heard laughter from the other side of that wood. Not joyful laughter, not the kind shared between people celebrating something meaningful. It was the laughter of someone carelessly wasting what was never theirs to begin with. Arrogant, self-satisfied, and shallow as foam on the surface of a glass. I heard the faint clink of glass bottles touching and the soft pop of a cork being pulled, that small, familiar sound I had heard thousands of times, each one making my heart skip with anticipation. Wine being poured, and then my daughter-in-law Vanessa's voice, sharp and quick like a freshly honed razor. "Oh, please, what's so special about wine anyway? It's just fermented grape juice. Drink up, drink up." She wouldn't even know the difference. Me, Adele Fontaine. A 65-year-old woman standing on the other side of the door, my palm pressed against the cold oak, hearing every word fall like drops of acid. I stood still. I did not cry. I did not get angry. I simply stood there. My hand rested against the door, feeling the chill radiating from within. The familiar cold I had personally controlled for over 30 years, kept precisely at 13 degrees Celsius, with 55% humidity, so that the bottles could sleep peacefully in perfect darkness. That cold was as familiar to me as my own breath. It seeped into my palm and straight into my chest, where my heart beat slowly with a strange calm. The Cabernet Sauvignon I heard being poured, I knew exactly which bottle it was without seeing it. That instinct comes to those who have lived with wine their entire lives. It was from the autumn of 1991. The same autumn my only son Daniel was born on September 23rd, while I was still harvesting grapes, the scent of soil not yet gone from my hands when they placed him in my arms in the delivery room. I had aged that bottle with a single, sacred intention. It would be opened on Daniel's wedding day. Only that day. No other. And now, Vanessa was pouring it for her Las Vegas friends, people I had never met, strangers sipping a 30-year-old wine as if it were something picked up at a convenience store. They had no idea what they were drinking. They did not deserve to know. I stood there for another minute, listening to more laughter, listening to Vanessa's voice. The way she spoke to her friends was nothing like the way she spoke to me. In front of me, she was soft-spoken, respectful, careful. With them, she was someone else entirely, practical, calculating, and cold enough to make me realize something I had long refused to face. I had never truly known my daughter-in-law. I turned away. I walked back to my room, the one overlooking the vineyard, where I had slept for 30 years and never once grown tired of waking up to rolling hills and green vines. And I sat down in my burgundy leather armchair, the deep red of a well-aged Pinot Noir, and I began to think. When a 65-year-old woman with 3 decades of wine-tasting experience sits in silence and thinks, it is not surrender. It is not acceptance of defeat. It is the sign of a storm gathering, quietly, patiently, and inevitably. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the dark, holding a cup of tea gone cold, letting everything unfold in my mind the way wine opens in a glass, layer by layer, complex and honest. And I thought about everything that had led to that night. I thought about 30 years. I thought about Robert. I thought about Daniel. And I thought about what would come next, not with fear, but with the cold clarity of someone who knows exactly what she is about to do. My name is Adele Fontaine. I was born in Beaune, in Burgundy, eastern France, on March 12th, 1958. I grew up among rows of Pinot Noir vines stretching across gentle hillsides, in the sound of wind moving through leaves, and the scent of clay mixed with limestone from the Côte d'Or, a scent I have never found anywhere else in the world, no matter how many vineyards I have visited. My grandfather, Henri Moreau, taught me about wine before I learned how to read. His hands were rough, hardened by soil and sun, but when he held a glass of wine, they became strangely gentle, like a mother cradling a newborn child. He used to tell me in French, his voice slow and warm like the earth breathing. Adele, Burgundy soil doesn't just grow grapes, it grows memories. Every bottle of wine is a diary of that year, the weather, the emotions, the work of human hands. A person who drinks wine without hearing its story is just drinking water. I believed that. I believed it the way one believes in the sunrise. And I carried that belief with me when I boarded a plane, leaving Paris in the spring of 1985, 27 years old, with a suitcase of clothes, a notebook filled with French scribbles, and a heart holding on to a dream, to bring my family's craft to a new land. I chose Napa Valley for a reason. After the Paris wine tasting of 1976, when California wines defeated French wines on French soil, shocking the world, Napa Valley became something of a legend in the wine world. I read about it, about Stag's Leap and Chateau Montelena, about the bottles that changed everything, and I thought, this is a place where history is being written. I wanted to be there when it happened. And the early years were not easy. I started as a harvest assistant at a small winery in St. Helena. Hard labor, beginning at 5 in the morning and ending at sunset. My hands stained purple from grapes, my back aching from bending all day. But I did not think about the pain. I thought about every cluster of grapes I placed into the basket, and what they might become after years of resting in a dark cellar. I am a woman. I am an immigrant. My English still carries a heavy Parisian accent that makes people ask me to repeat myself 2 or 3 times. In a world dominated by men, where people measure expertise by how many years you've lived in America, rather than what you actually know, I had to prove myself twice, 3 times over compared to anyone else. There were afternoons when I sat alone after everyone had gone home, staring at freshly pressed barrels of grapes, wondering if I was doing the right thing. But I had something none of them did, a sense of smell and taste, trained since childhood among the vineyards of Burgundy. I could close my eyes, take a small sip of wine, and tell you the exact harvest year, the region where the grapes were grown, even whether that summer had been particularly sunny. That ability wasn't magic, it was heritage. It was thousands of hours of learning and observing from a time when I wasn't even as tall as the grapevines. The owner of the winery where I worked, George Whitfield, discovered my ability at the end of my first harvest season. He was testing a new batch of wine and called everyone with experience into the tasting room. when it was my turn. I was the only one sitting at the far end of the table, small and quiet. I lifted the glass, studied the color, inhaled, and said, "This harvest isn't as good as last year. There was heavy rain in the third week of August. The grapes were diluted. Aging won't improve it much." I set the glass down. The room fell silent. Whitfield looked at me for a moment, then flipped through the winery records. In the third week of August, just as I had said, there had been an unusual rainstorm that damaged part of the crop. After that day, Whitfield asked to speak with me privately. "Where did you learn that?" he asked. "From my grandfather," I replied, "and from the soil." He nodded as if that explained everything. From that point on, I no longer had to harvest grapes by hand every morning. I began participating in tastings and quality evaluation, the work I had been born to do. I met Robert Fontaine in the summer of 1985 at a small wine exhibition in the town of Napa. He was an agricultural engineer, an Italian-American, studying irrigation systems for the hills of Napa Valley. Not the type of man I usually noticed. He was tall but not handsome, wore plaid farmer's shirts and muddy shoes as if he had just walked out of a field. But when I began talking about wine, about how soil shapes flavor, about the differences between limestone and clay, about why the same Cabernet Sauvignon grape grown on two different hillsides can produce completely different wines, Robert didn't check his watch. He didn't look away. He looked straight into my eyes and asked thoughtful, intelligent questions that showed he was truly listening, truly thinking with me. We talked for 2 hours straight. And when the exhibition ended and people began clearing tables around us, we were still standing there talking. Before we parted, Robert said, "I don't know much about wine, but I know a lot about soil, and I think we could learn from each other." It was the most romantic invitation I had ever received, not because it was clever, but because it was honest. 2 years later, we were married. 3 years after that, in 1990, we took out a bank loan and bought our first piece of land in Yountville, 12 acres of sloped terrain, poor soil, insufficient water, and neighbors who all shook their heads and said we were crazy. But I looked at that land and saw what others didn't. I saw potential. I saw the future. We planted Cabernet Sauvignon on the western side, where basalt soil retained heat well, Merlot to the south, where clay held moisture for the roots during dry seasons, and a small corner of Chardonnay in the lower ground, shaded in the afternoons, because I had a feeling I couldn't explain with logic that the afternoon climate there was perfect for white grapes. Robert respected my intuition the way he respected scientific data, so we followed it. The first 3 years nearly ruined us. The first year brought too much rain. The grapes ripened unevenly. The second year was drought. We had to pump water from far away. The third year, just as our first promising batch was nearing harvest, a storm snapped part of the vineyard trellis overnight. I stood in the rain, looking at broken vines scattered on the ground, and I cried, not from pain, not from despair, but because in that moment I didn't know what else to do. Robert stood beside me, laying his hand on my shoulder, saying nothing, just standing there, and his silence was enough for me to breathe again and continue. In 1993, our first Cabernet Sauvignon vintage from Fontaine Winery was born. I oversaw the aging myself. I inspected every barrel. I decided when it was ready to be bottled. when I poured the first sip into a glass and brought it to my lips, after 3 years of waiting, of doubt, of hope, I closed my eyes and tasted. Blackberry, cedra, a hint of tobacco, and beneath it all, something I could only describe as the character of the land, the distinct scent and flavor of the soil we had bought, worked and watered with our own sweat. I opened my eyes and looked at Robert. "This is it," I said. "This is what we've been searching for." Robert lifted his glass. I took a much larger sip than I did. He was not a refined taster, but he knew how to appreciate, and nodded slowly. "It's wonderful," he said. "This is our home in every bottle." From 1993 to 2012, nearly 20 years, we built Fontaine Winery from 12 acres to 60, from an experimental harvest to 8,000 bottles a year, from an unknown name to a brand listed by Wine Spectator, among the top 100 most anticipated wines in the world for 2 consecutive years. We did all of that not through marketing, public relations, or complicated business strategies. We did it by growing good grapes, aging wine patiently, and never compromising on quality. Robert often said, "Adele, our wine will speak for us. We just need to do our work well and let time do the rest." He was right, and that truth became the foundation of everything I built. Our son, Daniel Robert Fontaine, was born on September 23, 1991, in the middle of harvest season. I remember that morning vividly. I was standing between rows of vines, still picking ripe Cabernet clusters, when the pain began. I clenched my teeth and worked for another 15 minutes before finally letting Robert take me to the hospital. The nurse in the delivery room looked at my grape-stained hands and laughed. "You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met." That night, when Daniel was born, small, red, and crying as if he wanted to break the silence of the world, Robert ran out into the hallway, made a call, then rushed home. An hour later, he returned to the hospital with a bottle of fresh grape juice, pressed that very morning, not yet fermented, still carrying the pure scent of fruit. And he poured it into 2 plastic cups from the hospital cafeteria, placed one in my hand, and said, "We celebrate the boy. Next year we'll make a special batch just for him." "A batch?" I asked, exhausted but smiling. "A private batch, just to keep, for him to drink when he comes of age, on his graduation day, on his wedding day." Robert lifted the glass of grape juice, holding it up under the hospital lights. "The finest wine is the one that carries time and love. I want our boy to have that." And we did exactly that. Every harvest season from 1991 onward, I set aside a small batch just for Daniel, never sold, never opened, never touched. The 1991 bottle was to celebrate the day he was born, and the 1995 bottle marked the year he learned to ride a bicycle and kept falling all summer without ever giving up. That stubborn persistence that frustrated me and made me proud at the same time. The 2002 bottle was for the year Daniel graduated college, standing on stage with the biggest smile I had ever seen. The 2008 bottle was for the year he got his first job and called home at 11 at night, too excited to remember the time difference. All of those moments were sealed inside dark glass bottles, resting on their sides in the quiet darkness of the cellar, silently aging and deepening with each passing year. When I walked down into the cellar and looked at those bottles, I didn't just see wine. I saw my son. I saw Robert. I saw an entire life preserved. Robert left me on February 17th, 2012. And he died of a sudden heart attack in the morning while drinking coffee and reading the newspaper, exactly the way he had started every day for the 27 years I had known him. Quiet, peaceful, no warning signs. The doctor told me he likely didn't feel much pain. I never knew whether that was supposed to comfort me. Robert's death left behind a space inside me that had no clear shape. It wasn't sharp pain, it was a dull absence, like when you're driving and don't notice the sound of the engine until the car stops, and suddenly everything around you feels unnaturally silent. I missed him in every corner of the winery, the imprint of his boots along the dirt path to the vineyard, the wrench he used to leave hanging on the wall of the shed, and the habit he had of placing his hand on my shoulder whenever I was tasting a new batch of wine, as if simply standing there was enough. After Robert passed, corporations began knocking on my door, no fewer than 7 times in 3 years. They came with pre-printed contracts and carefully calculated numbers designed to look appealing. I received them politely, served them coffee, and refused every single offer. Because one thing I had learned from 30 years of making wine was this: anything truly valuable is never sold in haste. Fontaine Winery was not an asset. It was a legacy, Robert's and mine. It was what Daniel would inherit. It was the continuation of the story my grandfather had started in Burgundy, and no one was going to take that away. Daniel met Vanessa Chu in the summer of 2018 at a startup networking event in San Francisco. He told me about her over the phone, his voice carrying a kind of excitement. I hadn't heard from him in a long time, the voice of someone who had just found something they didn't realize they had been searching for. Mom, she's really smart. She works in real estate investment, and she's interesting. He paused. Do you want to meet her? Of course, I said, because I am his mother, because I wanted him to be happy more than anything, and because, if I was honest with myself, I had been worried about Daniel for quite some time. He was 37 and still living alone, spending too much time on work and too little on what truly mattered. I wanted him to have someone. We met for the first time in September 2018 at my home in Yountville. Vanessa arrived alone. Daniel was running late due to traffic, and I made coffee for the two of us while we waited. She was beautiful in a deliberate, calculated way. Expensive clothes without being flashy, neatly styled hair. Makeup applied with restraint. She shook my hand firmly, looked straight into my eyes, and said, "Mrs. Fontaine, I admire what you've built here. I read about Fontaine Winery before coming. I am a professional wine taster. For 30 years, my work has been to recognize what lies beneath the surface, the true flavor beneath the first aroma, the real quality beneath elegant packaging." And when Vanessa said that to me, there was something very small, very subtle in her voice, something just slightly too polished, just a little too smooth, that made my professional instinct stir and whisper, "Pay attention, observe." But I said nothing. I smiled and poured the coffee. Vanessa is smart, I have to admit that. Throughout that dinner, Robert was gone, just the 3 of us. She asked the right questions, laughed at the right moments, and knew exactly when to stay quiet. She didn't try to impress. She let Daniel shine, let him lead the conversation, and only contributed when asked. That is an extremely subtle social skill, and I know it's a skill, not a personality. After they left, I sat alone at the half-cleared dining table, staring at the unfinished glass of wine, and thought. I had no concrete reason to object. She was polite. She was intelligent. She clearly made Daniel happy. And perhaps, I reminded myself, perhaps I was being overly cautious. Perhaps I was just being the strict mother-in-law in my own head. I decided to let time answer. The wedding took place in June 2019, right on our land. It was a beautiful afternoon. The Napa Valley sky, a deep, cloudless blue. The vineyard rose lush at the start of the season, fragrant with wet grass, soft string music drifting through thousands of vines. I wore a cream French dress, the one I bought in Paris in 1995, and carefully kept for this day, stood in the front row, holding my bouquet, and cried. Not from sadness. I cried because I looked up at the altar and saw Daniel looking at Vanessa with the eyes of a man who saw nothing else but her. And I remembered Robert. I remembered the way he looked at me. And I wanted my son to have that. That night, after the guests had left, I went down to the wine cellar alone. I stood in front of the rack holding Daniel's collection. 28 bottles from 1991 to 2019. And I placed my hand on the 1991 bottle, the first one, the one celebrating Daniel's birth, and whispered, "Robert, our son is married now. Do you see it?" I believe he did, and I believe he was smiling. The first 6 months after the wedding passed smoothly. Vanessa was polite, occasionally helped me cook when she visited on weekends, and always asked about the winery with what seemed like genuine interest. I gradually lowered the guard I had built in my mind. But like wine fermenting in a barrel, slowly, invisible to the eye, yet impossible to stop, Vanessa's true nature began to reveal itself. First came the casual questions about the winery's finances. "Mom, how much does the winery make in a year?" Gentle, curious, as if it were just small talk. I answered vaguely and gave no specifics. She didn't ask again, smart in that way. Then came the suggestions about modernization. One evening, as we were having dinner, Vanessa talked about a wine resort in Sonoma she had just visited. They rent out their cellar for events. The income is very good. She looked at me. "What do you think if we did that too?" I said I didn't want to turn the cellar into an event venue. She nodded and let it go. But the topic returned a second time, a third time, each time wrapped in a different story with a new reason. Then came Daniel. I began to notice a change in the way he spoke to me. Not coldness, but uncertainty. He started saying things like, "Vanessa thinks that," or "we've discussed," and, in a way where "we" clearly didn't include his opinion as much as hers. I remembered when Daniel was a child. He was the most stubborn kid I had ever met. The good kind of stubborn, and the kind who refused to give up learning to ride a bike, even after falling dozens of times. Where was that child now? The summer of 2021 was the first time Vanessa formally suggested that I truly retire. We were sitting on the porch having afternoon tea, an entirely ordinary scene, and she said, her voice soft as cotton, but carrying something much harder underneath, "Mom, you've dedicated your whole life. You deserve to rest. We'll take care of everything. You don't need to worry about the winery anymore." She paused, looked at me. "And you're getting old. Drinking too much wine will only harm your liver. You're getting old." I lifted my teacup, took a sip, and looked out over the vineyard. A July afternoon in Napa Valley, golden sunlight pouring over the vines like honey, and as beautiful as every other afternoon. I had sat here and watched. "Perfect," I said. Vanessa smiled, satisfied. She didn't understand that for me, perfect was not agreement. It was a sign that I had noticed something and had begun to deal with it. In November 2022, Daniel and Vanessa moved in with me. The official reason was to make it easier to take care of Mom. The real reason, which I understood, the moment I saw the way Vanessa walked into the house and let her eyes assess every corner, was something else. The eyes of a buyer looking at someone else's property are very different from the eyes of a guest. They took over the large living room to host their friends. They hired a new manager named Marcus without consulting me, a middle-aged man, quiet, who always avoided my gaze in the way of someone keeping a secret. Vanessa began entertaining guests, business associates from Las Vegas, unfamiliar faces appearing in my house on weekend evenings, laughing loudly and talking about real estate and investments in a language I neither understood nor wanted to understand. And they started going down into my wine cellar. The first time I discovered it was on a Monday morning in November 2022, when I went down as usual after breakfast. I walked past each rack, my hand lightly touching the shoulders of the bottles, my morning habit for many years, no different from someone checking a patient's pulse. And I realized something was wrong. A few bottles had been moved, not many, not obvious, just enough that someone unfamiliar might overlook it. But I am not someone unfamiliar. I know my cellar like the palm of my hand, like my son's face, like the smell of earth after rain. I checked the cellar logbook, the dark blue leather notebook in which I had recorded every bottle, every position, every movement date for more than 20 years. Cross-referenced, checked again, and confirmed 3 bottles were gone. 1 bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon Reserve, 2010, worth about $3,000. 1 bottle of Merlot, 2008, around $2,500. And 1 I least expected, the 1997 Chardonnay, one of the most exceptional white wines of the estate, produced from a remarkable harvest when nighttime temperatures dropped unusually low, creating a rare, perfectly balanced acidity. I said nothing to Daniel or Vanessa. I changed nothing in my behavior. I observed, and I waited. December 2022, Christmas Eve. I told you about that night at the beginning of the story. The night I stood by the cellar door and heard Vanessa say, "It's just fermented grape juice." But I didn't tell you everything I was thinking as I stood there. I thought about Grandfather Henri, who taught me that wine is memory. I thought about Robert, who said the finest wine is the one that holds time and love. And I thought about Daniel, the baby I carried among the vineyard rows, the stubborn child who refused to give up learning how to ride a bicycle, the man for whom I had saved a bottle for every year of his life. And I thought, these people do not know what they are destroying, not because they are evil, although Vanessa is getting close to that, but because they truly do not know. To them, this is just wine. To me, this is everything. That was the moment I decided I would not let anything of mine be destroyed again, not out of anger, out of self-respect. February 2023, 2 months after Christmas, I heard that fateful phone call. That afternoon, I was in the study when Vanessa stood in the hallway outside my door, her phone pressed to her ear. She probably thought I was asleep. I usually nap at 2, and it was nearly 3. But that day, I wasn't sleeping. I was reading a book on the history of Burgundy wines that I had bought years ago and never had time to read. The room was completely silent. Vanessa's voice was low but sharp, and in the stillness of a Napa Valley afternoon, no wind, no traffic, only distant birds, every word reached me as clearly as if she were sitting in front of me. No, everything's fine. She's old. She doesn't know anything. We've already switched them. 12 bottles. The auction house has received them and confirmed. Get ready. Next month, it's done. That's a lot of money. I set the book down, gently, without making a sound. Switched the wine. I sat up straight and let those 2 words sink into every cell of my body. Not like a shock, but like puzzle pieces naturally falling into place, forming a picture that was clear, complete, and far more terrifying than I had imagined. The missing bottles. Marcus, the manager, always avoiding my eyes. The strange trucks appearing at the estate gates in the late afternoons when I was usually inside. And now, 12 bottles. 12 bottles bearing the Fontaine estate name, worth tens of thousands of dollars each, being sent to auction. But inside, not Fontaine wine. Inside was something else, cheap, worthless, poured into elegant bottles carrying my label to deceive buyers. This was no longer a family matter. This was a crime. And worse, the thing I had to sit with for a long time to truly face, was that the buyers at that auction would pay tens of thousands of dollars for bottles that had no value. They would take them home, perhaps store them in their own cellars, perhaps open them to celebrate a special occasion, a wedding, a birthday, an important achievement, and they would drink that counterfeit wine believing they were drinking Fontaine Reserve, believing they were sharing something truly precious. The Fontaine name, the name Robert and I had built over 30 years, the name my grandfather Henri had indirectly laid the foundation for through lessons about soil, grapes, and honesty, was being used to deceive. I could not let that happen. But I had to be careful. I needed undeniable proof. And I had to do all of this while Vanessa and Marcus still believed I was the old woman who knew nothing. I looked back at the book in my hands, The History of Burgundy Wines. I closed it and set it aside. Then I took out a blank sheet of paper and a pen. I have always preferred writing by hand over typing when I need to think clearly, and began to plan. Vanessa and Marcus's operation did not stop at 12 bottles. At the end of February 2023, Vanessa sat down across from me at the dinner table with a folder of documents, and Daniel sat beside her with the expression of a man trying to convince himself that what he was doing was right. "Mom," Daniel began, his voice lacking the certainty I remembered from when he was a child, "we want to talk to you about the future of the winery." Vanessa placed the folder on the table and slid it toward me. "Actually, Mom, the cellar is costing too much to maintain. The temperature control system needs upgrading. The security system is outdated. And," she paused for exactly 1 second to create effect. I recognized that tactic. "We found a very good offer from an investment company in Las Vegas. They want to buy everything, the land, the winery, and the cellar, to develop it into a resort. It's a very high price, Mom." I looked at the folder. It was a purchase offer drafted by a company I had never heard of. Celestial Ventures, LLC, based in Las Vegas. Offer price, $4,200,000. I knew the true market value of Fontaine Winery at that time, at least $6.5 million, not including the separate value of the cellar and its collection. This was nearly 35% below market value. "Take your time and read it," Vanessa said, her voice carrying something I could only describe as poorly concealed excitement, the kind of excitement of someone about to receive something they had calculated for a long time. "You're getting old, Mom. What's the point of holding on to the winery anymore? Drinking wine only harms your liver. Better to sell, take the money, and live comfortably for the rest of your years." "You're getting old," the second time she had said that to me. I looked at her for a moment, looked at Daniel, his eyes fixed on the table, not on me. Then I looked down at the folder, flipping through the first few pages at a leisurely pace. "Perfect," I said. "I'll think about it." Vanessa nodded, and that slight curl of her lips, the smile of someone who believes they've just won, did not escape me. She stood up, gathered her things, and walked out with the light steps of someone relieved. But she had left the folder on the table. I sat alone at the dining table after they both left, staring at the papers, and for the first time in months I felt something clear and sharp in my chest. Not anger, not fear. It was determination, cold, complete, and unshakable. They did not understand that when I say perfect, when I nod and smile and walk away, that is not the moment I am accepting. That is the moment I am beginning. That night, after the house lights went out and the sound of footsteps in the hallway faded into complete silence, I sat at my desk and opened the bottom drawer. I took out the dark blue leather notebook, the cellar journal I had kept for more than 20 years. Each page was a bottle, harvest year, vineyard, grape variety, aging date, bottling date, position in the cellar, notes on color, aroma, and my predictions of when each bottle would reach its peak. This was not just a record book. This was evidence. This was the map of the entire cellar, every bottle, every position, every change I had ever made, and recorded day by day. Any bottle taken, any alteration made, I could prove it. I opened the notebook to the most recent pages and began cross-checking. The 12 bottles Vanessa had mentioned in that phone call. I knew exactly which bottles they were. I knew their value. And I knew, with the certainty of someone who can taste a sip of wine and tell you the exact vintage, that if those bottles had been switched, I could prove it before any panel of experts. The next morning, I called Patricia Nguyen, the Fontaine Winery's lawyer since Robert was still alive. Patricia was a small woman with platinum hair and a voice so calm people often mistook it for indifference. But I knew that behind that calm was one of the sharpest legal minds I had ever encountered. Robert used to say, "Patricia is the woman you never want to face across the courtroom." I told her everything, from Christmas Eve to the phone call I overheard, to the offer to sell the winery at 35% below market value. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was silent for a few seconds before saying, "Adele, I need you to do exactly what I say, and we don't have much time." In the next 2 weeks, I carried out the 4 most important steps of my life, not with excitement or anger, but with the calm and care of someone aging a rare bottle of wine. Each step had to be done at the right moment, in the right way, without haste. Step 1. I contacted Dr. Howard Gallagher, a professor of food chemistry and a forensic wine expert at the University of California, Davis. Dr. Gallagher and I had known each other since a wine symposium in San Francisco in 2003. He was one of the rare academics who understood wine not just through the laboratory, but through the senses. I met him at a cafe in Davis, told him the story, and asked if he could help. Dr. Gallagher listened, so tapped his fingers lightly on the table, then said, "I need access to your cellar to take samples from the suspected bottles. Spectral analysis will give us the exact chemical composition. Those results can't be faked." We arranged for him to enter the cellar on a morning when Daniel and Vanessa went to San Francisco, which they often did on Fridays for social gatherings, and didn't return until evening. Dr. Gallagher took samples from the 12 bottles I had identified as tampered, using a specialized needle that left no trace on the cork and did not damage the external seal. The analysis results came 3 days later. All 12 bottles contained Cabernet Sauvignon from the Central Valley, a common wine priced around $18 to $20 per bottle. Not a single molecule of Fontaine Reserve was present. Dr. Gallagher signed the report and stamped it with the university seal. Step 2. I asked Patricia to investigate the auction company Vanessa had mentioned in that phone call. It took a few days, but Patricia identified it. Barrister and Cole Fine Wine Auction, based in San Francisco, scheduled to hold a major auction on March 28, 2023. In the preliminary catalog Patricia obtained through a contact in the auction world, there were 12 bottles labeled Fontaine Estate Reserve, various vintages, with a combined starting price of over $120,000. $120,000 for 12 bottles of $20 wine. Step 3. I called 3 people in the wine world whom I trusted the most and who held the highest reputations. The first was Jean-Pierre Moreau, a Frenchman, a former creative director of Chateau Montelena, who had worked in the wine industry for more than 40 years and could identify counterfeit wine as accurately as a spectrometer. The second was Sylvia Hartmann, a leading wine critic for Wine Spectator, whose reviews could raise or drop the price of a bottle by hundreds of dollars instantly. The third was David Kim, a Korean-American sommelier who earned the title of Master Sommelier at 29, the youngest in history, and who now managed wine cellars for 3 Michelin-starred restaurants in San Francisco. I met each of them individually, told the story, and asked a single question. Can you come to the auction on March 28th and testify for me? All 3 agreed immediately, without asking for further details. Sylvia said, "Adele, in the 30 years I've known you, you've never asked for anything without a very good reason. I'll be there." Step 4, and this was the step that took me the most nights to decide. I contacted Rebecca Walsh, an investigative journalist for the San Francisco Chronicle, who had once written about the growth of the Napa Valley wine industry and interviewed me in 2019. I did not tell her my story. I only said, "Rebecca, I'd like to invite you to an auction at the end of March. I can't tell you in advance what will happen, but I think you'll find it worth your time." She asked why. I said, "Because this is a story a real investigative journalist needs to write." Throughout those 2 weeks of planning, I continued to live normally. I had breakfast with Daniel and Vanessa. I listened as Vanessa spoke about plans to sell the estate, nodding thoughtfully at times, as if I were considering it. I said, "I'll think about it," exactly as many times as necessary to avoid raising any suspicion. Marcus continued managing the winery and still avoided my eyes whenever we crossed paths. Vanessa continued sending emails to Celestial Ventures, LLC, about the progress of the deal. I knew because Patricia had shown me how to access copies of emails through the home router, something entirely legal within my control. I did not sleep much during those 2 weeks, not because of worry, but because every night I sat in my room reviewing each step of the plan, searching for flaws, asking myself if I had overlooked anything. I remembered Robert used to say that careful preparation is what separates a great vintage from a failed one, not luck or raw talent, but patience and attention to every detail. I applied that to my plan. On the morning of March 28, 2023, I woke at 5 a.m., earlier than my usual time. It was still dark, but the air already carried the faint warmth of approaching spring. I made coffee, sat on the porch looking out at the vineyard rows in the darkness, and drank in small sips. I thought about Grandfather Henri. I thought about Robert. I thought about the 1991 Cabernet, the first bottle in Daniel's collection, that had been opened and drained on that Christmas night. It could not be recovered. Nothing could replace it. But I could prevent it from happening to other bottles. And I could ensure that the Fontaine name, the name Robert and I had built, would not be used to deceive others. I went inside and put on the outfit I had prepared the night before, the moss green suit I bought in Paris in 1995, still perfectly fitted after all these years because I had never let myself go. I tied my hair neatly, without extravagance, the hairstyle of a woman who knows she is going to do something important, not to put on a display. I wore the ring Robert gave me on our 10th anniversary, white gold with a small deep red ruby like a fine merlot, and I looked into the mirror. The woman looking back at me was 65, with salt and pepper hair and lines around her eyes from thousands of mornings under the Napa Valley sun. Not young, not perfect, but solid in a way I cannot fully describe, solid like earth, like stone, like vines whose roots have driven deep into the ground for decades and cannot be shaken by any wind. Le vin n'a pas peur du temps, I told myself. Wine does not fear time. I picked up my bag and walked out the door. Barrister and Cole held the auction at the Palace Hotel in Union Square, San Francisco, one of the most luxurious venues in the city, where every marble column and every gold-trimmed ceiling detail radiated wealth and status. The auction hall was vast, with high ceilings and glittering crystal chandeliers. Rows of white-clothed tables were arranged in perfect order. More than 100 attendees, wine collectors, investors, wealthy individuals looking to add valuable bottles to their cellars. I arrived earlier than anyone else. I chose a seat in the third row, slightly to the right, a position that allowed me to observe the entire room without drawing much attention, yet close enough to step forward when needed. Jean-Pierre arrived at 10 and took a seat in the 6th row on the left. Sylvia sat at the back, near the door, the position of an observer. David Kim stood in the standing area near the right wall. We did not look at one another. No nods, no acknowledgement that we knew each other. Rebecca Walsh sat in the corner of the room, blending in with the other attendees, with a notebook and her phone on the table. Vanessa and Marcus arrived at 10:45. They entered with two other individuals I did not recognize, likely partners from Celestial Ventures, LLC. Vanessa wore a black blazer, her hair down over her shoulders, and carried the self-satisfied look of someone about to claim what she had carefully planned for a long time. They sat near the front, not far from the auction stage. They did not see me, or if they did not recognize me. I wore a small hat and sat far enough from the aisle Vanessa would usually scan when entering a room. The auction began at exactly 11. The auctioneer, a silver-haired man in a black suit, with the warm, authoritative voice of someone who had been doing this for decades, introduced each lot with professional enthusiasm. Polite applause, paddle numbers raised, bids climbing. I heard none of it. I was waiting. Lot 17. The auctioneer lifted the microphone and spoke with a touch more gravity. Ladies and gentlemen, this is one of the most exceptional lots of today's auction. Fontaine Estate Reserve, Cabernet Sauvignon, vintage 1991. This bottle comes from the very first harvest of Fontaine Winery, crafted by Mrs. Adele Fontaine, one of Napa Valley's leading wine experts, on one of the rarest and most valuable bottles ever to appear at auction. Opening bid, $8,000. A murmur rippled through the room. A few paddles lifted, ready. I stood up. "Excuse me," my voice carried through the room, calm, clear, without a tremor. "Before proceeding with this lot, I request a direct inspection." The entire room turned to look at me. The auctioneer frowned with the polite irritation of a man interrupted mid-performance. "Ma'am, this is not standard procedure at Barrister & Cole." "I am Adele Fontaine," I said, not louder, not sharper, just my name clearly spoken and letting it do the rest. "And that bottle bears my name." 10 seconds of silence. 10 seconds in which I felt the air in the room shift, like when wine is poured into a glass and the first aroma begins to bloom, changing everything around it. Then whispers erupted across the room. Jean-Pierre stood. Sylvia opened her notebook. David Kim stepped out from the standing area and moved closer. "I request to examine the bottle bearing my name before it is sold," I said to the auctioneer, "and I have full legal standing to do so as the owner of the Fontaine Estate brand." The auctioneer glanced toward the barrister and Cole manager standing nearby. They exchanged a look for a brief second. Then the manager gave a slight nod. They understood that refusing inspection in this situation would be far worse than allowing it. The bottle was brought forward. I stepped up, took it in my hands. I held it under the overhead light. The color through the glass, even a casual observer could see the difference if they knew what to look for. A 1991 Cabernet Sauvignon should be deep garnet, dark and dense with faint violet edges, nearly opaque at the center when poured, the color of 30 years. What I saw through the glass was lighter, clearer, the color of a young wine, not an aged one. I pulled the cork. The familiar sound, pop, but even that was wrong. A long-aged cork absorbs wine and expands over time, creating resistance when pulled. This one came out too easily. I poured a small amount into the tasting glass set on the podium, lifted it, looked, smelled. The first aroma, fresh fruit, blackcurrant and raspberry. That is the scent of a young wine, not more than 5 years old. A 1991 Cabernet should carry notes of leather, cedar, and light tobacco, characteristics that only time can create. None of that was present in the glass before me. I took a sip, and I knew. I set the glass down, lifted my head and looked at the room. Hundreds of eyes waiting, absolute silence. "This is a Cabernet Sauvignon from the Central Valley," I said, my voice steady and without hesitation. "A commercial-grade wine, worth approximately $18 to $20 a bottle. It is not Fontaine Estate Reserve. It is not vintage 1991, and it is certainly not worth the $8,000 you just heard." Jean-Pierre stepped forward without invitation. He lifted the glass, smelled it, took a small sip, and set it down. "Je confirme, this is not Fontaine Reserve, not vintage 1991. I fully confirm Mrs. Fontaine's assessment." Sylvia approached the podium. She did not drink. As a critic, she only needed to observe and smell. But that was enough. "Confirmed," she said briefly, and in the voice of someone whose reputation speaks for itself. David Kim stepped forward last. He took a larger sip, holding the wine in his mouth for several seconds, the way someone does when they truly want to understand exactly what they are tasting. Then he spat it into the spittoon, a sign of professional respect, not disdain. "Central Valley Cabernet," he said, "harvested no more than 4 years ago. Retail around $20. This is not Fontaine Estate." The auction room exploded. Murmurs, chairs shifting, phones buzzing. At that exact moment, the doors opened and Dr. Howard Gallagher walked in. I had arranged for him to arrive 15 minutes late, precisely when expert opinion would need to be reinforced with scientific evidence. He carried a hard-bound report in his hand. "I am Dr. Howard Gallagher, University of California. Davis, specialist in forensic food chemistry," he said. "I have here the spectroscopic analysis report of 12 bottles, labeled Fontaine Estate, being auctioned today. All 12 bottles contain wine not produced by Fontaine Winery. This report has been submitted to the California Alcoholic Beverage Control this morning." Vanessa shot up from her seat. Her face, for the first time I had ever seen it stripped of complete control, turned pale as paper. "This is a misunderstanding. This is a mistake. Those bottles bear my name," I said, and now I looked directly at her for the first time since entering the room. "And no one has the right to sell something under my name when it contains something entirely different. That is commercial fraud, Vanessa." Marcus stood and moved quickly toward the exit, and but 2 hotel security guards, whom Patricia Nguyen had coordinated with management in advance, stepped forward to block him. At the same time, 2 plainclothes officers from the San Francisco Police Department entered. Patricia had contacted them 2 days earlier, provided all preliminary evidence, and requested their presence to handle the situation. Marcus was escorted out. Vanessa stood in the middle of the room, no longer in her sleek black blazer, no longer composed and calculating, just a woman realizing that everything she had planned had just collapsed. She looked at me. Her eyes, for the first time no longer masked, held something I recognized as pure fear. "Mom," she began. I looked at her for a moment. No anger, no satisfaction, just the calm of someone who had done what needed to be done. "You will receive exactly what you deserve," I said softly. Then I turned back to the auction podium, picked up the bottle, the counterfeit one bearing the Fontaine Estate Reserve label, vintage 1991, the bottle that should have been aged from the harvest of the year Daniel was born, and set it down, gently, decisively. This was the end of one chapter, and the beginning of the next. What followed in the months after unfolded the way important things in life often do, not with grand drama, but step by step, day by day, each step carrying both relief and exhaustion. Patricia Ngoyan filed a lawsuit against Vanessa and Marcus in Napa County Court for commercial fraud, intentional product substitution, and brand damage. The California Alcoholic Beverage Control opened its own investigation. Barrister and Coal Fine Wine Auction suspended all activities related to Fontaine lots and fully cooperated with the inquiry. Rebecca Walsh's article was published in the San Francisco Chronicle on March 31st, 2023, under the headline, "Wine Fraud in Napa Valley, a Story of Legacy, Greed, and the Woman Who Refused to Yield." The article told the entire story, the story of Robert and me, of Fontaine Winery, of 30 years built from soil, water, and patience, and the story of Christmas Eve, of the phone call, and of the auction on March 28th. The article was shared tens of thousands of times on social media within 24 hours. Wine Spectator republished an excerpt. A national news network featured the story on its evening broadcast. I did not watch the news during those days. I went down to the cellar every morning as usual, walked past each rack, resting my hand on the shoulders of the bottles like greeting old friends after a long journey, and gave thanks to something nameless that I could only call the quiet fortune of not having lost what mattered most. Daniel came to see me alone in early April. No Vanessa. They were living separately after the auction, and I knew the marriage was nearing its end, though no one said it aloud. Daniel came to my house at 3 p.m. on a Wednesday, when the sun slanted through the vineyard rows and cast long shadows across the ground. He knocked. I opened the door. We looked at each other for a moment without speaking. Then Daniel said, his voice breaking halfway through, "Mom, I'm sorry. I know there's no excuse. I didn't protect you when I should have. I let money and sweet words blind me, and I—" He stopped, looked down. "I betrayed you. I know that." I looked at my son, the baby I had carried in my arms among the vineyard rows in the fall of 1991, the stubborn child who refused to give up learning to ride a bicycle, the 32-year-old man standing before me now with the eyes of someone who had realized he was wrong and was not trying to justify it. I looked into his dark brown eyes, Robert's eyes, and saw not a cheap apology, but something more real and more difficult, accountability. I stepped aside to let him in. "Come in." I went down to the cellar and brought up a bottle, not one from the memory collection, though still needed more time and a more worthy reason. I chose a 2020 Chardonnay, a recent harvest, a white wine, still young and not yet at its peak. I poured 2 glasses and set one in front of Daniel. "This bottle isn't ready," I said. "It needs more time, but it can still become something good if it's placed in the right conditions and given the patience it deserves." I paused. "I think you're the same." Daniel looked at the glass for a long moment, then at me. And for the first time in years, I saw in his eyes what I had been waiting for. Not hesitation, not uncertainty, but something steady and real, like roots driven deep into the earth. "Can you teach me how to make wine?" he asked. His voice was soft, almost hesitant. Really teach me from the beginning, the way you learned from Grandfather Henri. I lifted my glass, took a sip of the young Chardonnay, and thought about that question, about everything it carried, not just technique and knowledge, but time, presence, the act of learning to listen to the soil and the sun and the wind instead of listening to voices that are not your own. Yes, I said, harvest starts in September this year. You come early and you do everything exactly the way I tell you. No questions, no suggestions about modernization. Just listen and learn. Daniel nodded. Okay. We sat drinking that young Chardonnay in silence. Outside, the vineyard rows were just beginning to take on the green of early spring. The air carried the scent of soil, wild flowers, and something I could only call a beginning. In September 2023, the case concluded. Vanessa was found guilty of commercial fraud and received heavy financial penalties, along with a 10-year ban from operating in the art and fine wine auction industry. Marcus Holt pleaded guilty and cooperated with the investigation to reduce his sentence. Celestial Ventures, LLC, the company behind the below-market acquisition offer, was investigated for other fraudulent activities and eventually dissolved. The cellar was fully restored to me. Patricia Nguyen ensured that every tampered bottle was properly documented, and I received compensation for their true value. I used that money to upgrade the cellar's security system, the kind of system even I cannot access without my own authentication code. Vanessa and Daniel divorced in November 2023. I was not happy about it. I truly was not. I never wanted my son to go through the pain of a broken marriage. But I also knew that sometimes removing what is no longer healthy is the necessary condition for something truly good to grow. In the spring of 2024, I opened the Fontaine Reserve Club on my own land, not a resort, not a casino or entertainment complex. This was a high-end wine appreciation club. Only 20 members, carefully selected, people who truly love wine, not just the feeling of holding an expensive bottle. I designed the space my own way. Low oak tables, real candlelight instead of imitation LED flames, and soft French classical music played from a real vinyl record. No screens. Phones left in a basket outside the door. Each evening, I personally stood before the members and told the story of each bottle, about the harvest year, the weather of that season, the decisions I made during aging, about everything that had to happen for a bottle of wine to become what it is. Membership filled within 48 hours of opening. Daniel came to help me during the harvest in September 2024, just as he had promised. He arrived early in the morning, dressed in old clothes, and worked beside me all day without complaining about the sun, the fatigue, or the ache in his back. We spoke little while we worked, not an uncomfortable silence, but the silence of two people understanding something that does not need words. At the end of that day, as the sun lowered and the vineyard rows cast long shadows across the red earth, Daniel straightened up after setting down the last basket of grapes. He looked out over the field, looked at his hands stained purple from the fruit. Then he looked at me. "Now I understand," he said. "Now I understand why you couldn't sell it." I said nothing. I simply nodded. This morning I went down to the cellar at dawn, as I have every morning for the past 30 years. The first light of day filtered through the small, hand-sized windows, casting a warm, pale golden glow over the rows of racks, a kind of light I never try to photograph, because I know no camera can capture what it feels like to stand inside it. I walked past each row, my hand lightly brushing the shoulders of the bottles lying on their sides, in long sleep. This familiar gesture is something I cannot explain, except to say that it is necessary, like touching the shoulder of a loved one to know they are still there. At the end of the cellar, I stopped in front of Daniel's collection. The bottles that remained after everything that had happened, 1995, 2002, 2008. The first bottle, 1991, had been opened. But I had aged a new one, a bottle from the 2024 harvest, the harvest Daniel and I worked together. That bottle sat beside the older ones, smaller and younger, but with its own story. I placed my hand on it, felt the temperature of the glass, cool and steady, exactly 13 degrees, and I thought about everything that had to happen for me to stand here in my cellar, with hands still my own, and the Fontaine name still intact. I thought about Grandfather Henri, who taught me that Burgundy soil grows memory. I thought about Robert, who said our wine would speak for us. And I thought about the night I stood at the cellar door, hearing Vanessa's voice, "It's just fermented grape juice," and feeling in it not just an insult to the bottles, but an insult to everything I believe in, everything I have built, everything I am. Wine has taught me this. Nothing truly valuable comes without time. Nothing truly profound can be created in haste. And nothing truly lasting is built without a foundation of honesty. People can switch labels. They can pour cheap wine into expensive bottles and hope no one notices. But they cannot counterfeit 30 years of a woman who has lived with the soil, with the grapes, with every shift in climate and every surprise of the harvest. They cannot counterfeit knowledge passed from grandfather to granddaughter through early mornings among the vineyards of Burgundy. They cannot counterfeit a sense of smell that has recognized thousands of wines and never been wrong. They cannot counterfeit true maturity, the kind that does not come from age alone, but from experience, from failure, or from nights spent in the dark asking whether you are on the right path. A bottle of wine does not lie, and the one who knows how to listen will always find the truth. There are people who believe that when you reach 65, your life has already passed its peak, that you are only a shadow of your former years, that you should step aside, stay quiet, and slowly withdraw from what once belonged to you. Those people have never understood wine. They have never sat down with a 50-year-old Bordeaux and felt something indescribable as they take a sip. The depth, the complexity, the complete story of 50 years unfolding in the palm of their hand. A 50-year-old Bordeaux is not a bottle past its time. It is a bottle at its peak, revealing the deepest layers of its character, showing everything it has endured from harvest to the present. And the one who drinks it must be worthy, refined enough, patient enough, appreciative enough to understand what they are being given. I am 65, and I am that bottle of Bordeaux. Wine improves with age. People, too, must grow in value as they age, not because time automatically creates wisdom. Many people grow old without learning anything from their years, but because those who have lived through enough winters and summers, endured enough winds and droughts, and learned true patience, not the patience of someone who has given up, but the patience of someone who knows that what is being aged will be ready in its time, carry within them something that money cannot buy and imitation cannot produce, an understanding of time and of people. This morning, I left the cellar when the sun had fully risen. I made a cup of coffee, not the convenient capsule kind Vanessa used, but hand-ground coffee, the kind I have had every morning since Burgundy, and took it out to the porch, sat down in the wooden chair facing the vineyard rows. Napa Valley in the morning has a kind of light I have never found anywhere else, a warm golden clarity that falls over the green vines and creates a scene I never tire of, even after tens of thousands of mornings like this. Somewhere in the distance, birds sang among the trees along the hillside, calm, unconcerned with anything beyond the present moment. I held the cup, took a sip, and sat still. Not still because of sadness, not because of exhaustion, but because this is something that took me a long time to learn. How to sit inside a beautiful moment and simply be in it. No planning, no worrying, nothing more to do. Just this morning, this sunlight, this coffee, and the vineyard beginning a new day. They thought I was old. They thought I knew nothing. They thought my silence was surrender, that my smile was acceptance, that the word perfect on my lips was the agreement of someone too tired to resist. They were wrong, and they learned that in a way I never wished to inflict on them, but there was no other way. I do not think of Vanessa often. I hope she learned something from everything that happened, but I do not hold illusions about that, and I do not let my mind wander in that direction. A good bottle of wine does not need to think about counterfeit bottles bearing its name. It simply continues to be itself and lets time and truth do the rest. I think about Daniel, about the harvest in September, about his hands stained purple at the end of the day, about what he said as the sun set. Now I understand why you couldn't sell it. There are moments in life when you know something is being salvaged. Not everything, not in the way you might have wanted, but enough to continue. That was one of those moments. I think about Robert, about the way he looked at me for 2 hours at that wine exhibition in 1985, and never once looked away. About his voice saying, "Our wine will speak for us." About his rough hands holding a small watering can among the vines in the early morning, not knowing I was watching. About his laughter, loud and carefree like a bell, when I told a joke in French he did not fully understand, but laughed at anyway. I miss him every day, not with the heavy pain of the early years, but with something warmer, quieter, the kind of missing that comes from knowing the ones we love do not truly disappear, but simply take another form, in every bottle from Fontaine Winery, in the smell of earth in the morning, in the way sunlight falls across the vines at this exact hour each day. Robert is still here. He never really left. I took another sip of coffee, set the cup down, and sat watching the vineyard in spring, the fresh green of the first buds, small and fragile yet determined, knowing the harvest will come when its time arrives. This is a different kind of smile, not the perfect smile, the one I use when I sense a battle beginning and prepare myself. This is something simpler, something truer, the smile of a woman sitting on her own land, surrounded by what she has built and protected on an ordinary and precious morning. And I know that no matter how many harvests remain ahead, no matter how many unknowns still wait, I will never let anyone take this smile from me again. Never again. The cellar remains cool and quiet beneath the house, the bottles still sleeping their long sleep, and I am sitting on the porch, drinking my morning coffee. This is everything, and this is enough.